after break and just initial. Also, the session on marketing, which was scheduled for October 28th, will be changed, and we'll notify you once we have set up a date. Okay? Today's session deals with how books are created. It's concerned primarily with the editorial functions of selecting and editing a manuscript. Our speaker is Mark Carroll, a graduate of Harvard College and Chief of Professional Publications at the National Park Service in Washington. Mr. Carroll has a long and distinguished career in publishing. He began as a college correspondent and district reporter for the Boston Post and later became news editor of a radio station in Boston. From 1951 to 1956, he was promotion manager at Yale University Press. After leaving Yale, he joined Harvard University Press as associate director, and in 1968 was made director. Mr. Carroll has been with the National Park Service since 1972. While at Harvard, Mr. Carroll served on the board of directors of the Association of American University Presses, the Association of American Publishers, and the American Book Publishers Council. From 1980 to 1982, he was president of the Society for Scholarly Publishing and also served as secretary of the Washington Book Publishers Association and was on the board of directors of the Beacon Press. He is currently a member of the National Committee of the Center for the Book here at the library and is a trustee of the University of Pennsylvania Press. Mr. Carroll is also on the editorial advisory board of the journal Scholarly Publishing and has been a book consultant for the World Bank and the Institute for International Research in Liberia. Mr. Carroll has established publishing courses at Cambridge Center for Adult Education, at Boston University, and at George Washington University. He has been a lecturer at the well-known Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course and at the Center for Publishing at New York University. And as I indicated to you on Tuesday, he and Mr. Lofquist were instrumental in designing today's, our program for today. I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Carroll.
I'm very pleased to be here, and I don't mind at all being bumped to this room because every once in a while I'm here at 5:30 in the evening discussing the Center for the Book over liquid refreshments. I'm delighted to be again in the world's biggest inbox. Publishing courses and books about publishing seem to be growing at a much more rapid rate than publishing sales. The whole mosaic of publishing, if you will, is a kind of jigsaw puzzle in which a lot of convening and sometimes competitive interests come together. And if I seem not to follow a logical, linear flow this morning, don't be alarmed, because that's the way publishing is. It's a kind of jigsaw puzzle. Or, as one of my mentors once said, don't talk to me about the romance of publishing. It's nothing but a lot of trivial little details. And we'll get into that later. Or as one of my contemporary colleagues says, publishing is trouble. I may not follow the outline exactly this morning because of the kind of overlap of activities that we'll be discussing. I have no slides. I think I'm at a disadvantage because I think when one has slides, one can put a slide on and contemplate it for some time, and thereby the clock runs on. But I do have a short musical excerpt about publishing, which I will play when the mood strikes me. The Association of American Publishers in 1977 put out a report called Publishing Positions, 30 Job Descriptions in editing, production, marketing, consumer service, and administration. And I will touch on that from time to time. The editorial function, they say, includes a wide range of job definitions and duties related to finding authors and illustrators and developing manuscripts. Sponsoring editors of general books tend to have a liberal arts background, presumably having had the opportunity to read widely and develop a critical sense of writing and literary style. They usually learn the techniques of acquiring and publishing manuscripts as clerical assistants working for experienced editors. College textbook acquisition editors normally begin as travelers, learning at first hand about the marketplace and about professors who may be potential authors. They also learn about the technology of publishing from their staff colleagues. It's a very great oral tradition, because though there are a lot of publishing courses, as I've indicated, and a lot of books about publishing, the publication process really builds a separate case history for every publication. And while you can learn from what has gone before and what is currently being done, you always can fine-tune a little bit more and change the product, as some call it, and the process. The editor deals with that fount of all creative activity, the author. Many manuscripts are produced, but few are chosen. There's a vast sea of unpublished manuscripts floating around this country, most of them west of the Rockies, on such subjects as world order and new governmental theories and universal wealth sharing and things like that. But a lot of those manuscripts are now being published because with the technology change and selector typewriters and all those things, you can do good-looking, inexpensive, camera-ready copy on your kitchen table. And in fact, there was a small publisher in Nebraska that was going to publish a book called How to Publish a Book on Your Kitchen Table, and I tried to buy it and they went out of business. But at any rate, it's very easy to get into print these days. Publishing is not as monolithic as it used to be. You don't have to be near those big, heavy, clanking machines. You can take your manuscript around to a high-speed Xerox shop and you can get a quick and easy binding, and you're in the publishing business as long as you send your money non-returnable and copies of the book to this place. There are sort of major leagues and minor leagues in publishing for authors. One example is the Whole Earth Catalog, which started as a local enterprise in California, and then Random House took on its distribution and gave it exposure in a market that it could not reach ordinarily. The Foxfire books started as a local endeavor. I believe some editorial scout or traveler found them and brought them to Doubleday. Many times the mass market paperback people will pick up books that have been published elsewhere and reissue them in their own edition for their different kind of market. I mean, paperback books that have been done for a local purpose. People get into authorship in various ways. Irma Bombeck, whom I'm sure you all read religiously, started by writing a column for a local throwaway shopping newspaper. And she got into print, and people saw her and encouraged her, and she went on to bigger and better things. Who knows how many book publishers there are now? Would the Copyright Office care to make a guess? I've got 2,500 here, but then I also have 5,000 or 10,000 question mark. Because it's, if you are a dealer in antique rugs and you publish a book on antique rugs under your imprint and sell it to your customers, and generally you are a publisher. And there are an awful lot of one-book publishing operations out there. Antiquarian Bookman magazine, which, as you know, deals with the secondhand market primarily, frequently runs page after page of ads by small specialist publishers, people whose main business is something else or something allied, but who are nevertheless in the publishing business. And it's very difficult to add up all these people. It is said that there are 70,000 people in American publishing today. I think this means people who work at publishing for a living, and I think the figure came from Bill Lofquist and his operation. But there are a lot of other kinds of publishers, many of whom are represented here in Washington, who are associations, but also publish. I lunched yesterday with a guy who works for the United States Pharmacopoeia, which makes sure the pills are right, and not about the packaging. And they publish a revision every 5 years at $75 and sell 250,000 copies. They regard this really as a kind of byproduct of what they're doing. They're not really publishers. There are a number of people like that we've turned up through the Washington Book Publishers, where somebody says, what's the Library of Congress? And the answer is, it's a library, but it sure is a big publisher too. The nurture of authors is a very difficult matter nowadays, because there's a lack of general interest magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and so forth that used to publish short fiction or serials or articles. So it's difficult for the beginning author, whether he's creative or dealing with facts, to find a print outlet for his work. Because it's through these small outlets, poetry journals, literary reviews, specialist magazines, if you will, that the editors, who sort of have the radar on the horizon, see who's in print and who might be encouraged to do more. There are books galore on how to become a best-selling author in your spare time, but I submit that authorship cannot be taught. I hope, by the way, that you will interrupt often and vociferously with questions or requests for elucidation or whatever. The author is an amorphous, very difficult to describe person. I may become an author sometime. Not sure where I'll publish to catch some editor's attention, but I'll do something. Maybe for the LC Quarterly. The author is the quarry of the editor. The editor is gatekeeper, scout, exhorter, pleader, wheeler-dealer, and a sensitive antenna for what's going on in the marketplace. He or she usually an omnivorous reader, often with specialties or hobbies. W. Norton for years published a series of books on yachting, small boat sailing, because the production manager was a nut on boats, and he knew the boating world, and he knew who was out there and who could speak coherently to the market. An editor is an idea person, looking out the window and saying, well, what if this? Which reminds me of a story Dana Pratt told me yesterday about a management consultant firm that went to the University of Texas Press and surveyed the operation, and they had two recommendations which caused some consternation. One was that the management firm went through the editorial department and saw that a number of editors were not really doing anything but looking out the window. And they didn't really think they should do that. They should be editing rather than thinking. And also that there were a number of books in the warehouse, maybe perhaps too many books in the warehouse, and the press really should print only the number it could sell. And publishers have been trying to solve that one for a long time. What if the editor for William Buckley's books took him to lunch one day and said, what if you wrote a novel? And he went off to Switzerland and wrote a novel. And he enjoyed it immensely. And he had a great time. And they put it into shape and published it. And he's now got this sort of second string to his bow, another string to his bow, which is writing fiction. And I never would have thought of him as a fiction author. Let me read to you the publishing position description of editorial director. I won't read it all, but of a publishing house. The alternative titles are publisher, and there we get into confusion already, editor-in-chief, executive editor, or vice president editorial. The basic function is editorial management responsibility, including planning and development of editorial program of a company or division, as well as budget control and staff supervision. Reports to the company head or vice president. His peers are the marketing director and promotion director. And he supervises senior acquisition editors, the managing editor, or project editor. The position requisites: bachelor's or equivalent, business and financial supplementary training, experience at least one full cycle of planning through a season or two, profitably publishing and producing revenues as a demonstration of track record. Administrative and organizational ability is required, editorial expertise and judgment, long-range publishing planning, budgeting and financial analysis, and staff development. Their performance is evaluated by profit and loss, return on investment, profit on gross margins, promotability of self and staff, and working relationships with other departments, authors, and customers. In other words, a paragon. A friend of mine, Alan Whitman, was publisher of the journals division of John Wiley. He has now gone to Macmillan to be publisher of the professional and scientific and medical books. A larger job, but the same kinds of subject matter, and he's also on the board and the vice president, so it's a step up. And in New York publishing particularly, there's a lot of musical chairs going on because you can change jobs without moving because there's so many publishing houses there. And everybody knows everybody else, so the grapevine is very, very good. And jobs are known and often filled before the obligatory ads appear in the newspapers and trade journals. And I'll skip the intervening editorial steps, but talk about copy editor and assistant editor. The new Chicago Manual of Style, which I hope you have in your office, it's an excellent summary of the publishing process and considerably changed from the earlier edition. Says, if I can find it, some trenchant things about the editing process. The editorial function is in effect two processes. The first, for want of a better term, may be called mechanical editing. This process involves a close reading of the manuscript with an eye to such matters as consistency of capitalization, spelling and hyphenation, agreement of verbs and subjects, beginning and ending quotation marks and parentheses, number of ellipsis points, numbers given as figures or written out, and many other details of style. The word style means two things to an editor. The first meaning is that implied in the title, A Manual of Style. Publishers refer to style in this sense as house style or press style. By the way, have you heard that there's going to be a new edition of the government printing office style manual? Don't expect it soon because they've just reissued the old one in paper as an interim to stave off the heat to get the new one out. Authors more often think of style in its other sense as a way of writing, of literary expression. Editors are, of course, also aware of this meaning of style when they undertake the second non-mechanical process of editing, which they call substantive editing, rewriting, reorganizing, or suggesting other ways to present material. The editor will know by instinct and learn from experience how much this kind of editing to do on a particular manuscript. An experienced editor will recognize and not tamper with unusual figures of speech and idiomatic usage, and will know when to make an editorial change or simply to suggest it, when to delete a repetition or simply to point it out to the author, and many other matters. Since every manuscript is unique in the amount and kind of substantive editing desirable, no rules can be devised for the editor to follow. Except for certain magazine publishers, no publishing house has a house literary style. Okay, the copy editor in the publishing office edits for style, consistency, spelling, etc. Deals with assistants in the editorial department and with production people. Education, college degree, or at least 3 years of college, with supplementary training in editing and proofreading. Prior experience as an editorial trainee or assistant preferred. Knowledge of conventional proofreading and punctuation standards and practices, knowledge of the publishing industry and production particularly, and skills in proofreading, spelling, and content understanding demonstrated in testing, performance evaluation criteria, meeting deadlines and budgets, and satisfied authors. How many sent flowers on publication day? And again, on this manual of style, I said it was considerably changed. Because the whole production process has changed, the section in the manual dealing with that is considerably enlarged because, as you know from your own work, so much of the production process is in-house and under the control, often of the editor, with the overall supervision of a production person. Editors in any number of publishing houses operate in different ways because of the work of the publishing house. People across the river at Time Life Books who are editors may do an awful lot more writing than an editor in a conventional trade book publishing house, but not more than an editor in a textbook publishing house, where much of the text is in textbook publishing is done by a team with an in-house writing editor, an expert in the subject, particularly in the elementary and secondary books, and reading experts or word counters or whatever. At Time Life Books, as you see from the copyright page, the masthead, they put together a team for each book, and they hire a name author to do, or authors to do the essays, but there's an awful lot of massaging of that text in-house to make it fit, to make it correlate with the illustrations, and so forth, so that a kind of book like building sun decks or whatever is a kind of manufactured, constructed book, built in-house. In fact, they've got a carpenter on the staff over there who builds things so that the illustrators can draw them and take pictures of them. The creation of books, which was sometimes a suggestion to a writer like Bill Buckley, has led to the packaging of books. There's now a National Book Packaging Association, and these are people who assemble series for paperback publishers. The Saga, the Revolution, or the Civil War series, or whatever. The Opening of the West. And these are all formula books, and they hire writers to write to that pattern. They also do this in the romance paperback field. And that kind of romance paperback is turning into another kind of almost magazine, because new ones come out every 6 weeks or so, and the old ones are thrown away. In addition to the lunching editors, the ones who go out and talk to authors and agents, there are those in-house or freelance editors who are the copy editors, as I mentioned, who prepare the manuscript for typesetting. The system is changing a bit because a lot of publishers are sending manuscripts out to freelance editors rather than keeping full-time editors on their staff, keeping a full complement of full-time editors, because it's cheaper. Because if you hire a freelancer, you don't have to pay health benefits and all kinds of things. The problem of quality control is not very good. And I have noticed that the quality trend in the handling of text in a lot of current books is not very good. Bowker just published Volume 4 of A History of Book Publishing in America by John Temple. And a number of times reading through that, I felt, gee, I wish some editor had read through this one more time, because there are typos and dangling participles and God knows what. A friend of mine who was the managing editor at the Stanford University Press worked for a publisher in New York, and he said, well, every once in a while we get mad at management. So we'd turn a manuscript over to production, say it was ready to go, it was all edited, when it wasn't. But he said, nobody said anything. Now, this is changing too, because, yeah, yes, sir.
Are you speaking now just of the mechanical type, or the substitute type too, as far as quality control?
Say that again, please.
When you're speaking of not so much quality control, you're just speaking of the mechanical part or the substitute part too. The reason I ask is I've been noticing in reviews in the New York Times and so forth in recent months the same thing, and they're saying that a lot of these editors are not really helping their authors to make a successful book, because they're not getting them to cut the stuff that should be cut and all that kind of.
Correct. The question is, given the situation where line for line mechanical editing and proofreading is not done to the level it should be, is the same thing the case in substantive editing? And I would say yes. There are a lot of books coming out with loose ends and repetition. And again, the Temple book, but that's in part because of the chronological nature of the study. But again, the technology is changing this, because certainly in the scientific and technical field, authors have access to computers and word processors. In some cases, in the humanities and social sciences, publishers are providing word processors to their authors. So what the author is sending in is not a manuscript. He may send in a copy for reading, for evaluation, for those who don't want to read it on the screen, but they send in the floppy disks. And this leads to the neverland of publishing journals online for computer systems, and I believe the American Chemical Society now has a journal that they publish that way, that if you have a computer system, you can access that journal. I think this is all right and proper and a logical development. I don't think that we need fear the disappearance of conventional print. Some of the other titles that float around an editorial operation: managing editor, special projects editor, executive editor, senior editor, acquisitions editor, search editor. It varies. Many editors, as indicated in here, start as travelers, selling books to professors for courses, and also bringing in book ideas to the home office, so that they've had experience not only with the academic departments and the output of them, but they've had experience with the way college stores work and the whole textbook process. And they have identified authors or books that the firm may publish in the future. And when you're successful as a college traveler, you usually move into an editorial position in the house. College traveler job is usually someone's first job, and they give you a car and the keys to the car and send you to New Mexico, Arizona, West Texas, and parts of Colorado. And you spend the time commuting from college to college. Which leads me to a little excursus here. One thing that the training and whatever committee of the AAP did some years ago was to publish a collection of anecdotes on how people get into publishing. Can you read the names? None of the contributions is identified by name inside, which is a fine thing. Publishing, like the law, loves precedents. We are always interested in the track record of an author, the category of a new book, the selling handle as an analogy. Your Education for Publishing Committee is no exception. We were struck last year by a book called The First Time. This, with a handful who did not immediately acquire a free copy, recounted the first sexual experience of a number of prominent, one might say, upstanding Americans, Art Buchwald, etc. What a precedent. We thought it might be useful to prepare a little sheaf of papers recounting the first-time experiences in publishing, etc. And these people said these were their first jobs in publishing: rights assistant, college traveler, publicity assistant, junior editor, production assistant, secretary, salesman, editorial clerk, junior accountant, chief accountant, treasurer, financial vice president, president, secretary clerk, school teacher, bookseller, college instructor, or librarian. How did you get your first job in publishing? I volunteered. By accident. I'm a member of the family. Through and as a student at NYU. 11 rejections and an acceptance. Help wanted ad, off the street. I was asked. Through the Dartmouth Placement Service. By knocking on lots of doors. Through an endless chain of tenuous connections. I bought the company. There's one more thing here. How long did it take you to reach your present position? 1 day or 20 years, depending on how you count, is one answer. Instantly was another. 7 years, 12 years, 2 years, and so forth. Should it have taken that long? And one fellow says, it's too early to tell. I've only been in my present job for 30 years. Here it is. And they said, what do you remember about your early days in publishing? An early recognition that publishing requires a professional appreciation of the creative tension between books and money, culture and merchandise. In short, spirit and matter. My first job as a publishing apprentice offered considerable experience in the cultural interface problem of professional emancipation. Somebody else said, I was astonished at the non-literary nature of publishing, of the number of technical skills required, of the dazzle and articulateness of the people, to say nothing of their commitment to the profession. And one person remembered that he was in well over his head. Another memory was trying to find a really good dry martini in Stillwater, Oklahoma. That must have been a college traveler. The first day on the job, without the hint of experience, I was asked to write a news release on a book for which no proofs or copy were available. The harried publicity director handed me half of a badly Xeroxed table of contents and told me to make it newsworthy, something reviewers would pay attention to. It was a good first lesson in what's wrong with publishing. And one other person said, I thought it was somewhat immoral to be paid to read. I still feel the same, but I don't return the paycheck. Well, editing is a long and noble calling, and there are all kinds of books on editing, technical, otherwise, and there's a paperback called Editors on Editing, which is an anthology of people in the early part of the 20th century writing about their experiences, and it's now very quaint because publishing isn't done that way anymore. And we have nowadays, to supplement the editor and the publisher, the agent. The agent is an honest broker. He's a sifter of ideas. They work on various levels. Some of them advertise in writers' magazines and read manuscripts for money. Some take on only new writers that they have confidence in or are referred to them. Some, and this is the trend with the big buck kind of publishing, are lawyers, and they're much more than intermediaries. They're financial advisors and support for their authors, business managers for the whole project, the whole income spectrum, and the Indian wrestling on contracts is often very protracted, and we'll get to contracts later. The agent's percentage is usually 15% of what the author gets, although some may get more and some may get less. Agents and editors have a very nice symbiotic relationship and lunch each other frequently. The publisher's lunch is not a 3-martini lunch, by the way. The very hip, trendy publishers have Perrier. At least last time I looked. But an editor, an agent can go to an editor and say, look, my author so-and-so is working on a long-range project for you, but that's sort of bogged down, and we'd like to try something else to get over this hump, and why don't we do something like this? And they sort of work out an idea for a book, and the agent takes it back to the author, and if the author likes it, they refine it and take it back to the editor, who then takes it to his editorial committee and publisher, and the wheels turn. Agents spend an awful lot of their time with subsidiary rights, the so-called secondary income that derives from a publication of a book either before or after publication, such as Jimmy Carter in Time magazine, such as Jimmy Carter in the Washington Post, such as Jimmy Carter in Reader's Digest condensed books later on, such as the paperback edition, such as the translations, such as the hand-signed, specially bound gift editions at a higher price. And as was suggested in here earlier, the whole literary and cultural and civilized advancement of publishing, which is why a lot of people like me are in publishing. We like it. But there's also this whole stratum necessary wheeling and dealing and making the numbers come out right. There's another kind of agent who is important in translations, for instance. There's a London literary agent called Curtis Brown, which has a New York branch, which I think has no connection. There's a New York firm called Curtis Brown, which has no connection with Curtis Brown London. But Curtis Brown London has sub-agents in France, Italy, Argentina, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, etc. And their job is to take books or forthcoming books from the US or the UK and make arrangements with the local publishers for publishing in the local language. Similarly, they work in the other direction, forwarding books to their clients in the UK or here, books or book ideas or manuscripts, for translation into English. Every year at Frankfurt, the World Book Trade gathers, and it's an absolutely awe-inspiring sight. You see all the books of all the publishing countries of the world in the space of a week within walking distance, and it's a very tiring walk. But all kinds of deals are done at Frankfurt. And you may have seen in the paper that they now give a Peace Prize at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and George Kennan got it this year. And I'm sure George Kennan's books and publishers were very much in evidence. But publishing is now sort of global. They were talking some years ago about sort of transatlantic publishing. And that's happened with the change in the copyright law, among other things, because so many English publishers now have companies in this country. A lot of them are in Boston or New Hampshire, places outside of the high rent district. But they can operate just as well because they're not that far from New York and from the advertising agencies and book chains and so forth. And one example of the editing problem in connection with this is that oftentimes if a book is published in England, they don't bother to change the American English to English English. And similarly in the other direction, particularly in scholarly or scientific books. With popular books, it's often done because it's on a tape and you can tell the tape to change OUR to OR in these instances. Again, the wonders of technology. All right, supervising this entire circus is the publisher, who is benevolent, visionary, learned, sensitive, acute, and effective person, an entrepreneur, aware of the past, looking to the needs of the present, and anticipating the trends of the future. He's the orchestrator of the activity of his creative editors and their ancillaries and his board and his bankers. The current trend, as I mentioned earlier, is to designate as publisher those who run discrete operations of large publishing companies. And in fact, McGraw-Hill is organized that way. They have 4 or 5 sort of McGraw-Hill companies with presidents and publishers of each, and they sell books to one another. The trade division may have a book that can be used as supplementary reading in college market, and they will work closely with the college division. The college division may have a textbook that has some general sales, so they sell some to the trade department. Question. Made a note to myself. How do you handle journals when you receive them for copyright? You get every issue of every journal.
Do you mean how do we process?
No, but I mean, what happens after you process them?
They go to the library's collections.
Do you get them on fiche often?
Some, but not many.
Okay. I'd like to take a minute now to show you have you hear what the publisher has to contend with. It's my equivalent of slides. This is from a musical comedy called The Thurber Carnival by James Thurber. And it was on Broadway maybe 15, 20 years ago. I apologize for the quality of the disc, but I played it over.
World, except one man and one woman.
Of course, the next items on the agenda are copyright and contracts. And I'm not about to talk about copyright to this audience, except to say that we publishers, and I was once a copyright publisher, not in the public domain, cherish copyright. And most publishing people I have had dealings with are so aware of the importance of copyright and what it means. And since I've been down here in Washington and dealing with publishing in the public domain, I've stayed in touch with other segments of the publishing industry, and recently, or not recently, some years ago, we tried to make arrangements with Norton to have a trade edition of the National Register of Historic Places, which used to be published every couple of years. It's not now published now because it's too big. It's on microform. And Norton was very interested in this, and they thought that they could find a market. They didn't see how they could rearrange the book to make it their own, to allow them to attempt to claim copyright for parts of it. And so they abandoned the project. As you know, the government printing office will make available to publishers at cost negatives of government publications, so that if you're publishing an income tax guide, you don't have to redo everything that's existing. You don't have even to go through the photography stage because you can buy the negatives. One of my friends at the Smithsonian said that they try once in a while in their public domain publications to include some copyright matter that they have been given permission to publish by the copyright holder, so that nobody can come along and photograph the whole book because they'd be violating that particular copyright. And we once published a book in the Park Service on the Revolution, the sites and the dealing with the American Revolution in nice color. And some publisher in New York photographed it and reprinted it black and white, and it looked awful. And I tried to tell him that we could have arranged to have him get the negatives, and he could have had a much better job and done much better. So I'm not going to talk about copyright unless there's an overwhelming desire to ask questions. I will talk about contracts, which can be anything between a handshake or a 16-page document, which is, I'm told, the Simon & Schuster contract. In the late 19th and early 20th century, many authors didn't have a contract. It was just a letter exchange with their publishers. But the rise of subsidiary rights, translations, digests, paperbacks, etc., and the segmentation of the market has made publication contracts all the more essential, and also the intrusion and the rise of the intrusion's a loaded word. The rise of the lawyer agent. The Authors League in New York has a model contract. Most publishers don't follow that model. They do their own, depending on what their particular needs are. They sometimes a contract is a Band-Aid kind of thing, because a publisher will run into a situation that isn't covered by the contract, so the next time he does one, he includes something so it won't happen again. Let me give you a quick summary of what is in the usual author-publisher contract. That's in this book, which has this wonderful chart on how books are refereed, evaluated, approved, edited, designed, manufactured, and sold. And it so shows the interrelationship of the various processes. This is the timeline, and this is the various departments who are dealing with the book. This is the University of Texas Press paperback. It's a very good summary, although it's got some math in here that I don't understand. And it has one of my favorite footnotes in all of publishing literature. Herb Bailey, the author, is director of Princeton University Press, and he's a scientific background, and he used to have in the days before calculators, he had a slide rule on his desk, and he'd figure out overheads, and royalties, and percentages of this and that. And somewhere in here he said that most of these equations are worked out with slide rule accuracy, but if you want to, you can round it up to the next dime or dollar or whatever to make it come out even. Anyway, on contracts, he says in summary, the usual parts are date, names of the parties to the contract, the author's grant of the full and exclusive rights during the term of copyright to publish or to cause others to publish. Many contracts restrict the grant in various ways with respect to area, language, form. Agents like to hold out motion picture rights, and they like to hold out, in many cases now, paperback rights, because if the publisher controls those subsidiary rights, the publisher takes half or 40% or whatever of the money that goes through, and if you contract directly with the motion pictures or TV or whatever, you get more money. The author affirms that he controls the rights which he grants, and the work is not a plagiarism and does not contain obscene or libelous matter. Some publishers now, because of a lot of nuisance suits, have a blanket insurance policy that covers authors against this kind of thing. The publisher's agreement to publish is, for instance, when the contract is made in advance or for an unfinished or projected manuscript, this usually contains an escape clause requiring the manuscript to be completed in an acceptable form. Certain standards, which are often quite vague, says Bailey. And that reminds you of the time William Safire wrote a book called Full Disclosure for Morrow. And Morrow had paid a lot of money for it up front, and they didn't think it was as good as it should be. So they refused to publish it. Doubleday published it, and I think some of the Morrow money went back to Morrow from Doubleday. Protection of sale, the author agrees not to write a competing book. Delivery of manuscript specifies the date of delivery, form, whether it's, in this case, typewritten in a double space, or maybe, again, floppy disk or whatever. It may also say what the author's responsibility is in terms of illustration material, permissions to quote, preparation of the index. There's a clause on author's alterations, cost of changing proof, above a certain amount which is charged to the authors. The author agrees to revise the manuscript of the book on the request of the publisher. The publisher agrees to insure the material. It specifies when royalties shall be paid, foreign language royalties, discounts for bulk sales, royalty-free copies, cheap editions, and so forth. It talks about the division of income from subsidiary rights, translations, serial rights before and after publication, et cetera, all of which we've touched on, condensation. The author usually gets half of this. There's a termination clause often which says if the publisher doesn't keep it in print for a certain, if the publisher does not have it in print and a certain amount of time goes by, the rights can revert to the author. The publisher often includes an option clause to ask for the author's next book, next comparable book. And there's often an assignment clause that says the agreement is usually binding on heirs and assigns, and it can't be assigned to anybody else without the consent of both parties. And some of these, as I say, are quite elaborate. The Princeton contract, which I once had, is in the form of a letter. Dear so-and-so. But it's printed. And Athenaeum publishers like that, so they got the same lawyer to do one for them with a slightly different wording. This book, which I think is marvelous, was put together by the Education and Training Committee of the University Presses Association. And what they did was create a hypothetical book called No Time for Houseplants, written under the pseudonym of Purvis Mulch by an editor. And 5 presses, Chicago, MIT, North Carolina, Texas, and Toronto, agreed to go through all the motions of this book short of manufacture. They were each given the same manuscript. They each evaluated it. They did publication costing projections. They edited parts of it. They included correspondence with the author. They include the contract. They include the marketing plan, et cetera, and they even did sample pages. Each one decided how they would do the book. And it's very interesting in terms of how 5 different publishers can assess the same manuscript and make it plan it in different ways. And it's a fascinating exercise in bookmaking. And in this, there are, as I suggest, the contracts. And the MIT contract says, "Dear Provost Mulch, we welcome the addition of your work," this is all printed, tentatively entitled "No Time for Houseplants." And it goes on for 4 pages. The Carolina Press has something called a memorandum of agreement, which is also 4 pages long. And I recommend this book highly for a quick course in publishing decision-making. There is a postscript to this. This book has now been published in a trade edition by William Kaufman, who was a publisher in Los Altos, California. And there is a postscript section in the book, which is the actual book as published by the University of Oklahoma Press. They saw a publishing opportunity here. They took this manuscript and published it as a real book. So the specifications for that are in the Kaufman edition. So his edition is sort of called One Book, 6 Ways. Well, while we're on the subject of contracts, I'd like to tell you a little anecdote about contracts. Charles Eames, the designer, polymath, was coming to Cambridge to give the Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. And it's customary that the Harvard Press publishes these. And so I sent him our contract, a blank contract. Said, "We'll discuss details when you get to Cambridge." So we had lunch. And I said, "Now about the contract." He said, "Have you ever read your contract?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It reminds me of instructions by a Japanese camera manufacturer on how to take pictures in San Francisco on a cloudy day." He said, "You've got things in there about special sales and bulk sales and special editions, and if you sell a copy to a blind virgin in the Hebrides in the dark of the moon, the royalty will be thus and such." He said, "I've had some experience with contracts." He said, "I worked for IBM at the first World's Fair with no contract." And he said, "Then I was doing some work for him for the Second World Fair, and somebody said, 'Gee, we ought to have a contract.' So they sent me a contract, and it was 22 pages long, and I looked at it, and I put it aside. And I was in New York subsequently to see Mr. Watson of IBM. And Mr. Watson said, 'Oh, by the way, they told me you haven't returned the contract.' And Charles Eames said, 'Of course not, it's unfriendly.' He said, 'A contract should be written so you don't know which side wrote it,' which I think is a very profound statement. So Watson pushed a button on his desk, and in came Nicholas Katzenbach, who was the chief counsel for IBM at the time. And Watson says, 'Is this an unfriendly contract?' And Katzenbach said, 'Yes.' So I had a very nice lunch with Mr. Eames, and as a result, I sent him a letter and said, 'Dear Charles, we will publish your book under the usual book publishing conventions, and we will pay such and such a royalty, and if we sell a copy to a blind virgin in the Hebrides in the dark of the moon, we'll make a special arrangement for that. Please sign this and return a copy to me,' which he did. Unfortunately, he died and he never did the book, but it was a nice episode. It got into print somewhere, I'm not sure where or how, but that's my contract story. Are there any questions about contracts?
It's not really, well, it's sort of a question. We have, of course, little to do with contracts.
Right.
However, we have seen, with the advent of the new law, some surprisingly respectable publishers who have created contracts that say, the last one that I remember handling said, the current copyright law requires us to obtain an author's rights before publishing work. People are using us to pry authors away from their rights, general feeling, or is it, do public, well, how would you regard such a contract?
Well, the question is, are the publishers correct in stating in their contracts that copyright law requires that they acquire all rights?
That's not the question, because I know that that's not true. The point is that there are some quite well-known publishers, particularly journal publishers, who do that. And does the publishing industry, insofar as you know, smile or frown on that practice?
I think that a publisher's intent, and let's say we're all dealing with the highest of motives, a publisher's intent is to acquire as many rights as possible with that first contract. And that's why when the lawyers come in, there's argument about including subsidiary rights and so forth. In journals, I'm not quite sure what the story is. I think in practice, journals often sort of get first use, but the authors have rights to republish in collections and so forth, because the journals themselves don't publish that way. However, if the journal is published by a publishing house that also has a list of professional, scientific, or technical books wherein they can use the material from the journals, then it would be to the publisher's best advantage to retain that kind of control. So I can't sort of give you a specific answer to that question without knowing more details. Yes, ma'am.
I understand that a lot of contracts between publishers and authors are fairly standard. I was talking to a group of writers not too long ago, and there was disagreement among them about whether or not a writer who was in the midst of getting a contract with a publisher should bother to try to negotiate some of those clauses, or assume that publishers would never yield on any of the clauses. What would you say?
The question is, should a writer in process of producing a work haggle over inclusion or deletion of subsidiary rights, or get on with the business of getting the book done and published? It depends on the level of the writer, it seems to me. If this is a first book, a first novel, or whatever, the author really doesn't have much leverage and ought to be very pleased to have a piece of paper saying somebody's going to publish my book when it's done. If you're a 2 or 3 book author, then, and you don't like the way your publisher is dealing with you, you go to another publisher who may do better by you. This happens all the time. Sometimes authors stay with one publisher for years and years and years, but will go to another publisher for a special lecture series or a special anthology or children's book or whatever. So it depends on who the players involved are. I remember one time the president of Norton, who published Barbara Ward, complained about universities luring his authors away with large honoraria lecture appointments, which the authors were glad to have, but they claimed at Norton that this sort of interrupted the work Barbara Ward and others were doing for that publishing house, and they said, you shouldn't do this without consulting us, but I don't think that happens, because we felt that in those cases an author is a consenting adult and can sign a contract and can tell the other publisher if they want to, and particularly if it's not a competing work. I want to spend a couple of minutes on manuscript evaluation. Peer review, as I'm sure you all know, is standard in scholarly, technical, and scientific fields. Although there is a small, and I think growing, group of people who say, well, look, we don't want to spend the time waiting for a peer evaluation. We want to get this material out. We don't want to wait to get the referee's comments and react to them and then rewrite or recast or whatever. And so there are now some journals that are specifically labeled as being unrefereed, that the editorial staff decides what will be published, and they don't send it out to people knowledgeable in the field for review. There's considerable brouhaha about this, and the Council of Biology Editors had a meeting a couple of months ago that was written up in Science magazine, and there was quite an argument, but it wasn't settled. This is also a problem, can be a problem with these kind of online journals that are in computer network systems, where you want to restrict access to something till it's ready to be released, but you've got to send it around to have people see it, and others may creep into the system. In novels, you notice that first and other novels come out festooned with quotes from other authors. And this is done by the editor or the agent to create a favorable climate, and it sort of gives a mark of approval. A lot of works are committed to publication without having it read outside the publisher's office. But again, it depends on the kind of manuscript and the audience and the author and all the rest of it. I was once at lunch at the National Geographic with the people in their book division, and with David Godine, publisher in Boston, doing books and printing and publishing and poetry and things like that. Very nice list. And the Geographic people were telling how they chose books to publish. And what they do is that they draw up a letter with a list of possible book subjects, the steppes of Russia or whatever. And they circulate this to 20,000 of their subscribers, which number in the millions. And they rank the responses. And if they don't get enough response, they don't publish it. Or if they're really interested, they'll sort of retitle it and rearrange the author and subtitle and send it out again to see if they can get a better rating. So David Godine says, well, don't you ever get up in the morning and say, I don't care what the response is, I'm going to publish this book because I think it'll be a good book. And the Geographic editor said, well, I can understand that, but he said, we really have to secure the widest possible audience for our publications, meaning sell as many copies. And their printings, fresh printings, are 300,000, whatever. And they, in the course of this lunch, they asked David Godine what he published, and he was telling him, and he said, I'd do editions of 3,000, 5,000, 6,000 copies, first printing, 2,000. The Geographic said, hell, we waste that much paper getting our presses started. So, the manuscript evaluation, again, is a very particular thing. There are classes and customs that you follow, depending on, again, the author, the publisher, the audience, the purpose of the book. I want to talk a bit about books in conclusion. This is a free book. It's published by International Paper Company. It's sold. And this is the 12th edition, and it's copyright from 1979 through 1963. It's 2 1/4, but paper distributors to printers have these to give to their customers. And if you can get on to somebody to get one for you, unless you want to send $2 a quarter to New York, it's very good on the systems of printing, typesetting and printing, how illustrations are made, things like that. It's not threatening. This is a book which is now in the paperback, second edition, $6.95. I don't think it's on that list. This is mainly for writers because it talks how to put manuscripts together, talks about the insecurity of editors, what the agent's role is, where to submit manuscripts, how to submit manuscripts, getting what's coming to you, the outbreak of hostilities, judging publishers, doing the contract quadrille, agents, lawyers, the Authors Guild, and going it alone, how the books are put together, the self-publishing option, etc. Resources, useful book. This is also a second edition. This is a much more serious, this is sort of gung-ho, tell from the title. This is a careful description of the publishing process, published by Balker. A little bit of a prologue of past history, what the industry is, how books are created, how books are manufactured, how books are marketed, how they're stored and delivered, how publishers finance, plan, and manage what is happening in the future. I compared it with the first edition. What happened usually was that they left the existing text alone and added some paragraphs at the end of each chapter to bring it up to date. Some of you may have seen this go across your desk. Quarterly, I have this one from 1977 because it has an article on the publishing contract, but there's also an article on a guide to the new U.S. copyright law, regional publishing, simplified graphics, etc. It's a good place to look things up. This I mentioned. Last but not least, a book from the West Coast, The Passionate Perils of Publishing. Unleashed, the book about books. The literary industrial complex, the muddled madness of the media barons. The saga of the independent press, an ardent tale in an unnamed land. Self-publishing, a world of romantic ravishment. And the fires of the feminist press, the women who won't wait. But there is also some useful publishing information in here. For instance, here they tell how much this book cost and what process cost the money. The plant cost was $3,500, one-time cost, typesetting. Printing was $4,000. They got the fervid fuchsia cover because it was a closeout. The printer couldn't sell it to anybody else. They got it very cheap. Marketing, they spent $1,500. Mailing list, some ads, free books for review, and $4,500 for distribution, which was cost of shipping books and processing orders. And they added in only $1,000 for overhead. So what happens is that there are 5,000 copies of this book, 7 by 10, 80 pages, costs $14,500. Cost per copy is $2.90. $1.50 to make it, $1.40 to sell it, and they sell it for $5. It's priced too low. Thank you all.